Good morning, afternoon, and evening, my fellow Magma munchers. In this video I'll be making a Conjurer magic tier list. Over the past few days me and my friend have been interviewing Conjurers in-game, so we could understand how each magic works in a Conjurer build. We have been testing each magic interaction, so we can ensure that we make an accurate tier list. Many other tier lists just read off of the wiki without actually doing any testing, and as a result they give false information. For example, ice does 20% more damage against bleeding enemies. This may be true when using the ice magic, but after testing we were able to see that the ice imbued weapons do not actually get this damage bonus. This tier list was made using our newfound knowledge from testing to make sure we create a fair, accurate, and most importantly objective tier list. Before I begin, I'm just going to give a few disclaimers. This tier list was made during update I.II.9. Things may change in a future update. It is a fact that some magics will be objectively better than others, but don't be discouraged if your magic gets placed low on this tier list. Finally, it takes a long time to make videos like these, so I would really appreciate it if you can leave a like and subscribe. Thank you all for 400, 450, and soon to be 500 subscribers. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, guys. Now without further ado, let's just get right into this tier list. Acid magic belongs in S tier. It applies the unique corrosion status effect, which lasts for 10 seconds, doing great damage over time. This corrosion status effect also stacks with bleed, meaning you'll be doing twice the amount of damage over time. In addition to that, acid actually does an increased amount of damage against bleed, and this translates over into your imbuement, meaning your imbued attacks will naturally be doing more damage against bleeding opponents. So for all of those reasons, acid magic belongs in S tier, and this isn't even mentioning how annoying it is just to play against acid magic. The corrosion effect actually partially obscures your vision, which can throw you off, and the damage over time can completely negate your HP regeneration. Acid is also very visually appealing when it comes to its imbuement, especially the green variation of it. Acid has great magic damage when it comes to its damage over time, it has a very good magic speed, and it has okay magic size. Moving on to our next magic, we have Ash. Ash belongs in C tier. The main appeal of Ash is the fact that it leaves lingering ash clouds, which gives you great area control and denial. That being said, when you imbue ash into your weapon attacks don't actually leave any of these lingering ash clouds. You'll have to manually swap to your ash magic to shoot it and leave these lingering ash clouds, and this takes away from your overall potential as an ash conjurer. You also can't use ash underwater, meaning you'll have to unimbue your weapons just to use them underwater. That being said, ash actually positively reacts with bleed, increasing its overall damage output, while still maintaining this bleed effect. So for all of those reasons it's in C, and the fact that it positively reacts with bleed is why it's not any further down below. It's an overall solid magic, with an okay damage multiplier, an okay magic speed, and a very good magic size. Up next, we have Crystal Magic. For those of you who have seen my Crystal Conjurer video, you'll know exactly how good Crystal Magic is. Crystal Magic belongs in S tier. We can actually split every magic into two categories: damage over time and raw damage output. Acid is the king of damage over time. Crystal is the king of raw damage output. Crystal has the unique effect of doing an extra 35% more damage every 4th hit. This will always apply, even on multi-shot attacks like the Flintlock Scatter Shot. Crystal also has a very good base damage multiplier, a very good attack size. However, its only drawback is its slightly slow attack speed. However, you won't really notice this when you're being very aggressive, up in people's faces, doing an extremely huge amount of damage. Its unique effect of doing increased damage every 4th hit will also naturally activate in the flow of combat, meaning you will be naturally doing more damage just for using it. It also reacts with bleed, letting you do more damage against bleeding opponents, whilst still maintaining that bleed effect. So for all of those reasons, it is an S tier. Moving on to our next magic, we have Earth. Earth belongs in C tier. There isn't much to say about Earth, other than Crystal completely outshines it. Earth has an extremely slow attack speed. So slow, it's actually noticeable and detrimental to how you play. And while it does have the biggest attack size out of every other magic in the game, this isn't very useful. Earth positively reacts to bleed, meaning your overall damage output will increase just for using Earth. You can also use it underwater, unlike Ash. However, the fact that it's extremely slow and doesn't have any other unique interactions or effects is what's keeping it in C. This isn't even mentioning that the imbuement looks extremely bad, especially the soil variant of it, which literally looks like Up next, we have Explosion magic. Explosion belongs in B tier. Explosion is everything Earth should have been. It has a huge AoE, whilst still having a good damage multiplier and magic speed. Explosion also positively reacts with bleed, meaning each imbued weapon attack will do increased damage against bleeding opponents, while still maintaining that bleed effect. Explosion also applies the charged status effect, which doesn't directly benefit you as the Conjurer, but can benefit your friends if any of them use any heat-based magics, like fire, ash, or plasma, allowing them to petrify your opponents. You cannot use Explosion underwater, however its AoE is so big that you can actually shoot the surface of the water, and you might be able to hit anyone caught in the water. That being said, it's only placed in B, as its unique status effect char doesn't actually directly benefit you, but all in all, it's a solid magic to use in a Conjurer build. Moving on to our next magic, we have Fire. Fire belongs in E tier. Even though the wiki says Fire should be doing more damage against bleed, for some reason in game, this doesn't actually happen. Fire applies burn, which takes priority over bleed, so when you imbue fire into your weapons, and you attack someone, the bleed effect will get removed. It won't even react with the bleed effect to do more damage. It will just apply burn, which doesn't do great damage over time. It doesn't help that fire is completely useless underwater, meaning you'll have to unimbue your weapons just to get any attacks off. All in all, fire isn't that great of a magic to use. Any magic that removes the bleed effect, and doesn't even react with the bleed effect, cannot go any higher than D. Moving on to our next magic, Glass. Glass belongs in B tier. Normally to apply bleed with your weapons, you need to use a weapon skill and do a good amount of damage. However, when imbuing glass into your weapons, it will make every weapon attack apply bleed. This in conjunction with the fact that glass is an extremely solid magic all around, having a good damage multiplier, good magic speed, and good magic size, makes it extremely consistent. That being said, even though glass is supposed to do more damage against bleeding opponents, this doesn't actually translate over into your weapon imbuement, and as a result, you'll be missing out on some damage potential. Now moving on to Ice, I know many of you will be shocked by this placement, but Ice belongs in the F tier. I don't know if this is bugged or intended, but for some reason when you hit an enemy with an imbued ice weapon, all it does is remove bleed. It does not react with the bleed to do more damage, it removes it instead, and this makes Ice completely useless in a Conjurer build, as all it will be doing is reducing the amount of damage you do, as it has a 0.925 damage multiplier. The only good thing about Ice is you can shoot it at the surface of water to make little ice platforms that you can stand on, but that's at the cost of not even being able to use it underwater. It is literally better to not imbue your weapon than imbue your weapons with ice. I know many of you are interested in how ice pairs with the Sunken Sword, and all I can say is the Sunken Sword is a very bad weapon. It is very hard to hit people with the Sunken Sword to soak them, and even though you can freeze people, using it with ice, freeze only lasts about 0.3 seconds, which is not enough to have any sort of impact. You can only freeze people every 10 seconds as well, which makes the reaction very inconsistent and infrequent to pull off. I have also placed ice in F tier below fire magic in E, because ice does not have a damage over time effect. At least fire has some sort of damage over time effect. At least that gives it some sort of damage increase, whereas with ice all it does is reduce your damage output and make it so you don't even have the bleed interaction. Moving on to light. Light belongs in the B tier. It's a very interesting magic, having the fastest attack speed in the entire game, and that's at the cost of a slightly lower damage multiplier. Its attack size is completely unchanged. When imbued into weapons, it will make your weapon projectiles extremely fast, and this can make it easier to hit shots, but it can also make it easier to miss shots depending on how used to its attack speed you are. You will mostly be using light in PvP against actual players, as it's completely useless against NPCs, where the blinding effect doesn't actually affect them. Against players, you can inflict blindness. It is very rare that you actually fully blind someone, and you aren't told how blind someone is. When you do fully blind someone, it only lasts for 1.5 seconds, which isn't enough to take advantage of. That being said, its fast attack speed makes it feel very fluid to use, and will let you zip around, and make you very annoying to play against. The slight blindness that you do give to people from hitting them with light imbued attacks can be enough to throw them off, which you can take advantage of if used correctly. That being said, light doesn't have any positive damage interactions with bleed, which is why it is placed at B. However, it also doesn't have any negative damage interactions with bleed, which is why it's not placed any lower. It is a completely neutral magic that you can use alongside your weapons to add a blinding effect to them. A quick tip for light: make sure you use the sunlight variant of it, as it has more yellow, making it much more brighter and much more noticeable, which can throw off your opponents more than if you was using moonlight, which is much more dimmer and easier on the eyes. Moving on to lightning. Lightning belongs in D tier. It has the exact same problems as ice, and the only reason why it's placed higher than ice is because it has a faster attack speed, which is actually pretty useful. It also shreds your frames, which is another thing in itself. Anyways, lightning has a low damage multiplier, and also removes the bleed effect without even reacting to it, meaning you'll actually be doing less damage by imbuing your weapons with lightning, as opposed to just not imbuing your weapons with anything. Lightning also has a stun effect called Paralyze. Similarly to ice, when an enemy is soaked you can stun them with Paralyze. The stun only lasts about 0.3 seconds, which isn't long enough to do anything with. You can also stun people with Paralyze if you do more than 33% of their health in a single hit, but as a Conjurer, especially a Lightning Conjurer, you will never hit that high. All in all, Lightning Conjurer is a very bad magic to use for a Conjurer build. I know it is very common though. From the Conjurers I was interviewing, so I could make this tier list with accurate information by analyzing the interactions and the damages they each did. About 70% of the Conjurers I interviewed were all Lightning Conjurers, and of that 70%, around 60% were Purple Lightning Conjurers, interestingly enough. I don't know why it's common. But anyways, besides being so common, it's not so good. And that's why it's in D tier. Moving on to Magma, what my channel is named after, Magma. Magma is unfortunately being placed in D. Now it is being placed above Lightning, as it does have a good damage over time effect, and for that reason as well, is why it's placed a whole tier above Fire. However, as with any other damage over time, heat-based magic, it is completely useless underwater. You cannot use Magma underwater. You have to unimbue your weapons to use them underwater if you have Magma. Magma also has a very slow attack speed. It has the same attack speed as Earth, so it's so slow to the point that it's actually noticeable and impactful to your gameplay. Now the melt effect takes priority over bleed, meaning that it removes the bleed effect, and it doesn't even react with the bleed effect. And the melt effect is not good enough to replace the bleed effect with. That being said, it does have a good AoE, and it can also be used to shoot out water to make those obsidian platforms in case you're stranded out at sea. But like I've said before, any magic that doesn't react with bleed, going as far as to even remove the bleed, cannot go any higher than B or C, which is exactly why it's placed in D. Moving on to Metal. Metal was placed in high D tier. Everything Earth does, Metal does worse. Metal, when it comes to a Conjurer build, is just a worse version of Earth, especially when it comes to its imbuement, as Metal has a lower damage buff multiplier than Earth. Metal is also much slower and has a smaller attack size on top of that than Earth. So everything I've said about Earth applies to Metal, but in an even worse form. When it comes to the Metal imbuement, it looks really weird. Metal over Metal. Metal does react with bleed, increasing the damage you do against bleed whilst maintaining that bleed effect, but like I said, not to the extent that Earth does. So all in all, it's a worse version of Earth when it comes to a Conjurer build. If Conjurers were able to use ultimate arts and pulsars, then Metal would have been placed slightly higher. But since Conjurers have to use the worse version of Metal, especially when it comes to its imbuement, it's not that great. It's outshined by Earth. And now we move over to Plasma. Plasma is placed in D tier, below Magma but above Lightning. It's one of those heat-based damage over time magics, which takes priority over bleed, which is why it can't be placed any higher than D. It has to be under B or C. It's a worse version of Magma, as the Scorch effect only lasts 3 seconds. You can't use it underwater, and you can't even shoot it at the water to make the obsidian platform like you can do with Magma. However, Scorch is much more better than Burn, which is why Plasma is placed higher than Fire. It's also placed higher than Lightning because of that Scorch effect, but that's about it really for Plasma. It doesn't react with bleed. It takes away bleed without even reacting to it, in favor of Scorch, which only lasts 3 seconds, which is barely any time. All in all, try to avoid Plasma, unless you like how it looks. It does look very good when it comes to its imbuement, but that's about it. Moving on to Poison. Poison is another really good magic, but is it as good as Acid? No, it's not, and that's why it's placed in A tier. Everything Poison does, Acid does much better. The only difference is Poison leaves those gas clouds, but similarly to Ash and its Ash clouds, you have to swap to the Poison magic to actually leave those gas clouds. And also similarly to Ash, you probably want to build intensity and attack size into your build when you are using Poison. And intensity is not a really good stat to build into a Conjurer build. Also with Poison, it has a much lower damage multiplier than Acid, and the damage over time lasts 20 seconds. And since the damage over time is based off of the damage of your first hit, if you do a low damage first hit to enable that damage over time, that will be 20 seconds of low damage over time compared to Acid, which has high damage, and 10 seconds, meaning you can constantly reapply Acid and have high damage over time as you're doing higher damage per hit with Acid. All in all, Poison isn't a bad magic at all. It reacts with bleed to do increased damage, whilst also stacking with bleed, meaning you do also get twice the amount of damage over time just like you do with Acid. It just has a lower damage multiplier, and the fact that the Poison effect lasts longer is also detrimental when you are hitting for a lower amount of damage. Moving on to Sand. Sand is an A tier magic for a Conjurer build. It is another one of those raw damage output magics. It has extremely good attack size, an okay attack speed, and a very good damage multiplier. It also partially obscures your opponent's vision when they get hit with Sand, which can throw them off. It also reacts with bleed, increasing the damage per imbued weapon hit while still applying the bleed effect. It also creates sand piles, which can be a good or bad thing depending on where they get placed. All in all, Sand is a very solid magic to use in a Conjurer build. In between the two categories, it definitely fits into the raw damage output magic category, which is exactly why it's placed below Crystal, as it is not as good as Crystal for raw damage output, but it's still a very solid magic all around. Moving on to the edgy magic, Shadow. Shadow is going to be placed in high B tier. Now, Shadow magic, you can use it underwater, which is why it's placed above Explosion, but that being said, Shadow magic has no positive damage interactions with bleed, unlike Explosion, which does, meaning you'll only ever be applying bleed with Shadow, you won't actually be reacting off of it to do more damage. The reason why it's placed in B is because it's consistent and has solid stats all around. It definitely is one of those raw damage output magics, but it also looks extremely cool. It obviously isn't as good as sand, as crystal, but it's still a very good, solid choice to pick if you like how good it looks as well. It does apply a status effect called Drained, which makes your screen dark, and this barely will ever throw off your opponent, as it just makes your screen go black and white. You can still clearly see things, but it is a cool effect nonetheless. All in all, Shadow Magic is a very solid choice. It doesn't excel in any area really, it doesn't react with bleed, but it doesn't negatively react with bleed to bring it down to the likes of D, E, or F. It's just a solid choice all around. And now we move on to Snow. Snow has the exact same issues as Ice, which is why it's also going to be placed in F. That being said, it's going to be placed above Ice in F, and that's because it actually partially obscures your opponent's vision with a snowy effect, and it also actually maintains the bleed effect. It doesn't react with bleed, it just lets it persist. Now Snow has the exact same stats as Ice, except for its attack size. It is slightly bigger than Ice. You can shoot the surface of water and a nice platform will appear. You can't use it underwater. Snow is often described as the colder version of Sand because they have pretty much the same effects and stats, but there's a huge difference when it comes to its actual interactions in game in a Conjurer build, as Sand actually reacts with bleed, whereas Snow doesn't. So if you like the way Snow looks, you might also like the way Sand looks. So you might even be able to consider picking Sand and actually sell with a really good magic for a Conjurer build. And now we move on to Water. Now Water is a solid choice, but in this case solid doesn't mean good. It's actually going to get placed in C instead of B, right underneath Explosion. Now with Water, it will actually react with the bleed from your weapons, increasing your overall damage output per hit. However, the Soaked effect isn't as good as the Charred effect in this case. The only interactions you can really get from Soaked are Paralyze and Freeze, both of which don't last long enough to have an impact. And with Charred, you can actually petrify enemies, which is in the same category as Paralyze and Freeze, but with Charred, not only can you get petrification, you can also get a huge array of other interactions that increase the damage of other magics, which allows for greater synergy with other team members. Explosion also has a much higher AoE than Water. Water is just solid all around. It's so solid, it's such a general magic, and it doesn't shine in any aspect, which is why it's placed in C. Now we move on to Wind. Wind is being placed at the lower end of C. Wind is one of those gimmicky magics that you'd actually use in a Conjurer build. I wouldn't actually use Wind in a serious build where I want it to do damage. I'd use it when I want to have fun and knock people back. But that being said, the knockback you get from the imbued form of Wind isn't as strong as the knockback you get from the magic form of Wind. Wind also doesn't remove the bleed effect, but it doesn't react with the bleed effect to do increased damage. In order to make the most of the Wind knockback, you want to build a lot of intensity, but obviously intensity is not a good stat to incorporate into your Conjurer build. Like I said, it really is one of those gimmicky magics. It is solid all around to use, but if you wanted to make a serious build, I would not recommend it, especially since the knockback can be detrimental to your combo potential. If you are pushing people away from you whilst you are trying to land consecutive hits, it can actually lead you to lose a lot of your damage potential. And for all those reasons is why it's being placed in C. And now we move on to Wood. There really isn't much to say about Wood, as it's an ugly, really bad, useless magic to use in a Conjurer build. It has no damage interactions with bleed, meaning it won't positively react to do more damage, but it won't remove bleed either. You can use it underwater unlike fire and everything else below fire in F tier, but it is completely useless. There isn't much to say about it. It gets completely outclassed by every other magic above it. It's very bad. I would not recommend building a Wood Conjurer at all. You cannot get any reactions from it. It won't increase your overall damage potential. It's a much more worse version of Metal, which is a worse version of Earth, which is a worse version of Sand, which is a worse version of Crystal. It's at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Avoid using Wood at all costs, unless you want to torture yourself.